The contact appeared at 0317, station time. I know the exact moment, because I was the one who logged it. That is what I did. That is all I did. For 11 years aboard the picket vessel Soreth Nal, which was a small and undistinguished ship assigned to signal intercept work at the outer edge of whatever system the propagation fleet happened to be processing. We were not soldiers. The propagation fleet had soldiers enough. We were listeners. We sat at the edge of things and recorded what we heard, and if we heard something worth reporting, we reported it, and the fleet strategists decided what to do with it. 11 years, 14 systems. Not one of those 14 systems had offered us anything worth more than a routine log entry. I had expected the 15th to be the same. The propagation fleet had been in this system for 6 weeks by the time the contact appeared. That was standard. An advanced survey was always the first phase, small probes, passive observation, building the library of the target civilization's communications architecture, before the active phase began. The advanced survey ships were not part of my watch. They worked in the inner system, close to the third planet, monitoring the civilization's radio and data network traffic, logging the frequency allocations, and encoding standards and syntactic structures that would eventually allow the fleet's broadcasting platforms to replicate those transmissions from the inside. It was careful work, precise work, the kind of work that, done correctly, meant the active phase would conclude quickly and cleanly. I had nothing to do with the advanced survey. My function was the outer watch, the passive array at heliopause, the continuous sweep, the log of what arrived and what departed, and what passed through the system's outer dark. In 6 weeks of outer watch on this system, I had logged 11 cometary returns, 2 survey probes entering and 1 exiting, the fleet's own patrol vessels, making their regular passes at the outer formation boundary, and nothing else of note. This was normal. Outer watch was almost always nothing of note. It was still important. A fleet processing a civilization needed to know if anything was coming from outside the system. If a neighboring power noticed the fleet's presence and dispatched vessels, if the target civilization had pre-positioned warning buoys that we had not located, if anything in the outer dark was moving toward us with purpose. 11 years, 14 systems. Nothing in the outer dark had ever moved toward us with purpose. I kept the log accurate. I kept the instruments calibrated. I ran the sweeps at their specified intervals, and I logged the results, and I drank the bitter synthesized beverage that passed for tea on a ship like the Soreth Nal, and I watched the passive array return nothing more interesting than the background radiation of a universe that did not in this region seem inclined toward dramatic events. At the Zu-31, the universe revised its position on that matter. At Zu-37, it was not. The picket was positioned at the heliopause of the system, which was where we always positioned, far enough to give warning if anything came in system from the outer dark, close enough to maintain reliable relay contact with the fleet's outer formation. The work was cold and repetitive and required a particular kind of patience. The patience of someone who does not need interesting things to happen in order to do their job correctly. The passive array ran continuous sweeps at 6-second intervals, and the sweeps returned what they always returned at heliopause distance. Cosmic background radiation at standard levels, stellar wind gradients consistent with this system's output classification, the faint and familiar electromagnetic trace of the fleet itself deeper in system, and occasionally, the long-period drift returns of cometary bodies making their slow orbital passages, or the compact, precise signatures of the survey probes that the fleet's advanced elements had seeded through the system weeks earlier to characterize the third planet's communications architecture before the processing operation began. What came back at 0317 was none of those things. The contact was small in absolute terms. That was the first thing I noted, a single return, not a formation, sitting just inside the heliopause boundary at a position that had been clean on the previous sweep 6 seconds earlier. It had appeared between sweeps, which implied either a very high approach velocity from outside the system or something I did not have a framework for. The passive array's initial dimensional estimate put it at approximately 2.4 kilometers in length and perhaps 800 meters across the beam. Against the military scale of what I spent my working life monitoring, those numbers were middling. The propagation fleet's frontline destroyers ran to 900 meters. The signal suppression columns, the large processing vessels that formed the operational backbone of any active operation, ran to 3.8 kilometers. A 2.4 kilometer contact registered as neither large nor small. The word that came to mind was ordinary. What was not ordinary was the signature. I want to take a moment here in the log to explain something about signal intercept work that is relevant to what follows. There is a quality of attention that comes from years of monitoring passive arrays in quiet systems. A calibration of the mind, not just the instruments, that allows you to sit at a station for an 8-hour watch without losing the edge that a critical return would require. You develop routines. You develop patterns of attention. You learn which sweep results are interesting and which are noise. And you develop the capacity to recognize the interesting ones very quickly, because quick recognition is the point of the whole exercise. What I had not developed, what I do not think any signal intercept technician in the fleet's history had developed, because there had never been reason to, was the capacity to recognize a return that was interesting in a way that the entire classification system had no category for. The system was built on the assumption that everything you would encounter had a category. Everything was either a known vessel type, a known signal profile, a known debris class, or a known anomaly. Unresolvable was itself a category, technically. But it was a catch-all for instrument malfunctions and data corruption events, not for contacts that were genuinely outside the classification architecture. In 11 years, I had never encountered a contact that was genuinely outside the classification architecture. I want to be honest about what that meant for my initial response. I ran the diagnostic. I reran the sweep. I flagged the supervisor. These were the correct steps, and I executed them correctly. But I was working within a framework that told me the most likely explanation for an unresolvable return was a hardware or software fault, and I was looking for the fault. I was not yet looking for the other possibility. Marathon looked for the other possibility faster than I did. That is worth noting. The passive arrays classification engine ran automatically on every contact above a certain size threshold. It pulled hull emission data from the contact. The faint electromagnetic leakage of hull materials under the constant low-level bombardment of stellar wind particles, alongside drive wake trace characteristics, thermal gradient mapping, and the structural resonance profile that allowed us to distinguish, for example, a vessel with a standard 4-chamber drive configuration from one with the 6-chamber layout, favored by certain civilizations in this region of the galaxy. The classification engine ran all of this against the propagation fleet's combined archive. Over 30 years of accumulated contact data from every military and commercial vessel the fleet had encountered across its operational history, and returned a best match classification within a few seconds. For this contact, the engine ran for 11 seconds before returning a result. 11 seconds was anomalous. I noted it in the log, then watched the result appear. Unresolvable, composite interference. I had not seen that result before, not once in 11 years. I ran the diagnostic immediately, because the obvious explanation was instrument error or processing fault. The diagnostic came back clean on every component. The array was functioning correctly. The classification engine was functioning correctly. The hardware was not the problem. I ran the classification sweep a second time, manually, specifying the identical parameters. Unresolvable, composite interference. I flagged it to my shift supervisor, Marathon, who came to my station within 40 seconds. She was a lean woman of middle years, with an exceptional analytical mind and very little patience for ambiguity, which was in some tension with the fact that ambiguous signal returns were a regular feature of our work. She had an opinion on every instrument reading, every signal profile, every anomalous contact we had ever encountered. She looked at the unresolvable status, and then at the dimensional estimate, and then at the drive wake trace scrolling down the secondary analysis column, and for 11 seconds she said nothing. I counted the seconds without meaning to, because the quality of her silence told me something was wrong, and I had entered the state of mind in which I counted things. The drive wake trace was clean, not clean in the sense of a small or low power drive, but unambiguous, without the distortions that came from drive field damage or non-standard configurations, and consistent, no variation, no fluctuation, no course adjustment across the sweep window. Something was maintaining a steady inward bearing at a speed that had not varied by more than 0.3% since the first return. Marathon said, "Run a component sweep." A component sweep was a more granular analysis procedure for contacts that resisted standard classification. Instead of asking the engine to match the contact signature against the archive as a unified profile, It broke the contact into its constituent elements and ran each one against the archive independently. Hull material resonance was matched separately from drive field geometry, which was matched separately from weapon mount emission profile, which was matched separately from power core output signature and structural resonance characteristics. The idea was that a modified or composite vessel might not match any single archive entry as a whole while still having identifiable components. I had run the procedure perhaps 40 times in 11 years, mostly on heavily modified commercial hulls, and twice on what turned out to be debris, aggregates drifting under residual drive field influence. Marathon sent the active array return up the priority channel. I watched her face while she waited for the response. She had been doing this work for 19 years. She had logged more systems than I had, seen more anomalous returns, handled more contact analysis escalations. She was looking at the close-range return the way she looked at things that required her to update her understanding of what was possible, which was a specific quality of stillness that I had learned to recognize as her most serious mode. The silence on the channel was longer than it should have been for a routine escalation. I noted the silence the way I noted everything, in the log, with a timestamp, because silences on priority channels were data. What I could not log was what I was beginning to feel, which was a kind of deep structural unease that was different from the operational alertness of monitoring an unusual contact. The unease came from the implication, not the fact. The fact was manageable. There was an anomalous contact with an anomalous construction, and the fleet was handling it through its standard escalation chain. The implication was what I could not quite look at directly. The implication was that the 11 processed entries in our archive were not, as I had always understood them to be, the ends of stories. They were the materials for a different story, a story that someone else had been writing, in the dark from our own files for a very long time. I logged the silence. I logged the drive wake trace update. I logged the contact's continued inward bearing. I kept my attention on the instruments and my hands on the keyboard, and my log precise and current, because these were the things I knew how to do, and doing them correctly was the only response I had available to the thing I could not yet bring myself to articulate fully. I ran it. It took 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it returned, I looked at the result column for a long time before I said anything at all. The contact's hull material resonance matched 11 separate archive entries. Not one, not 2 or 3 as you might see with a refitted hull. 11 in overlapping and fragmented sections, as if the hull's material had been literally assembled from pieces of 11 different ships, each section showing the characteristic resonance profile of a different vessel. The drive field geometry partially matched 3 entries. The weapon mount emission profile fragmentarily matched 7 entries. The power core output signature matched 2 entries with moderate confidence, and 4 others with lower confidence. The 11 hull material entries were not from 11 different civilizations or 11 different operational regions of the fleet's history. They were from 11 different human vessels, all of them logged in the propagation fleet's military contact archive over the preceding 22 years, each one listed under the same status flag. Processed. Processed was our word. It was chosen carefully, I think, by whoever first established the fleet's operational vocabulary for its combination of precision and finality. A vessel designated processed had been encountered, assessed as a communications-capable threat, eliminated, and had its complete signal profile archived in full. The file was closed. The entry was reference data. The vessel would not require further attention. Processed meant concluded. Processed meant done. 11 processed human vessels, their hull resonance signatures, drive field geometries, weapon mount profiles, all of it present in the contact before us, overlapping and interlocking and assembled into a single coherent structure that matched none of the 11 individually and all of them simultaneously, in the way that a mosaic is none of its component tiles alone while being unmistakably composed of them. Marathon read the result column twice without speaking. I watched her face change, not to panic, not to anything dramatic, but to something I had not seen in her before. The look of a person who has just understood an implication they cannot ununderstand. She walked to the communications console and opened a priority channel to contact analysis. Contact analysis was the fleet's highest-tier analytical body below strategic command, the division staffed by the most experienced signal interpretation specialists the fleet carried. I heard her read them the component sweep result, line by line. I heard the analyst on the other end ask her to repeat the entry count. She did. The channel went to hold. Hold mode on a priority channel was not a thing I had encountered before. Priority channels were for contacts requiring immediate high-level attention. They did not hold. I noted the time, 041. I watched the contact on my passive array while we waited. It had not changed its bearing or its speed. It was still moving inward on a line that pointed directly at the third planet, which was the one we had come to process. The third planet held a civilization at the technological stage the fleet's advanced survey teams had characterized as capable of interstellar communication but not yet interstellar travel, precisely the stage that was the fleet's operational target. We had spent 3 years building a complete library of that civilization's communications architecture. Every frequency they used, every encoding standard, every linguistic and syntactic structure, every relay network topology. We were ready to begin the active phase. The active phase of processing involved broadcasting corrupted versions of the civilization's own communications architecture back into its relay network, using the correct frequencies and syntactic structures, so that the corrupted signals were indistinguishable from legitimate traffic. The corruption propagated through the network. A civilization whose communication network has collapsed cannot coordinate a response, cannot call for outside help, cannot mount anything beyond local and isolated resistance. 14 civilizations had not survived this process. I had logged the beginning and the completion of 14 such operations. And I had thought about the number, the way you think about a number that belongs to your professional context, accurately, without particular weight. Sitting at my station at 0414, watching a contact that had 11 processed human ships woven into its hull, and a drive wake that refused to be anything other than purposeful, I found myself thinking about those 14 civilizations differently, about whether any of them had had a signal intercept position at the edge of their system, about whether there had been a technician there who had watched us arrive and not fully understood what they were looking at until it was too late for understanding to be of any use. I closed that line of thought and kept the log. At 042, contact analysis came back on the priority channel. The analyst relayed the division's updated assessment. The contact was to be reclassified from unresolvable to unknown military vessel, single. The fleet's tactical response division was to be formally notified. The contact was not to be engaged without tactical response authorization. It was to be monitored at maximum passive array resolution with continuous logging of any change in bearing, speed, or emission profile. The propagation fleet would continue its primary processing approach to the third planet on the existing timeline. The unknown vessel would be tracked until tactical response issued updated guidance. The unknown vessel did not change its bearing, its speed, or its emission profile. It maintained the same deliberate inward course it had held since 0317. At 0441, tactical response issued notification to the fleet. The unknown vessel received contact identifier UMV Sorith 0317. A 3-vessel intercept element would be detached from the fleet's outer security picket to conduct an active range investigation. 2 light destroyers and a signal-capable tender. Combined mass approximately 14 times the mass of the contact. Standard procedure. Single unclassified contacts in operational zones were typically navigation errors, damaged commercial vessels, or survey probes from neighboring civilizations. They resolved quickly. The intercept element began their approach bearing. The contact held its course, inward, unhurried. At 0509, the intercept element reached active array range and pinged the contact. The ping went out cleanly. The return came back cleanly. High resolutions, no signal degradation. The data quality was not the issue. At close-range active array resolution, the contact's hull was exactly what the component sweep had indicated, and considerably more specific. The seam lines were visible. The boundary points between sections of hull drawn from different source vessels, each section showing the specific oxidation pattern and microabrasion signature characteristic of its original ship. Someone had cut those sections free and welded them together with a precision that the fleet's own maintenance facilities would have found technically impressive. The weapon mount emplacements were original, not drawn from any of the 11 source vessels but designed from scratch, in geometries that the tactical archive had no entry for. The power core configuration was a novel arrangement of 2 recognizable core types coupled in a way that was not documented in any reference archive the fleet carried. A great deal of engineering work, A long time of engineering work. I thought about the decision that had preceded it, about what a person would have to understand about the propagation fleet's cataloging method before they could look at an archive of 11 processed vessels and see in those 11 processed entries not 11 records of finished threats but 11 sets of raw material, hull sections available for use, drive geometries available for use, weapon mount profiles available for use, power core configurations available for use. Because the fleet had cataloged them with the intention of never needing to look at them again, and therefore had, without understanding it was doing so, made them freely available to anyone who understood that an archive entry was not destruction but preservation. We had concluded those ships. We had not destroyed what we knew about them. We had stored what we knew carefully in the belief that stored information was safe, inert, no longer relevant. Someone had read our store and found it very relevant indeed. Marathon forwarded the active array return up the priority channel. At 0600, roughly 13 minutes into the engagement, I noted something on the passive array that I have not yet described because I was still in the process of understanding it when I observed it. I want to describe it accurately, so I will take my time. The contact's emission profile, as it moved through the engagement formation, was not static. I had expected the composite interference signature to remain constant. The 11 ghost hull return that our classification engine could not resolve was a structural property of how the contact was built, and structural properties do not change during movement. What changed was something subtler, and I noticed it only because I was running a particularly detailed spectral analysis on the return out of professional habit, logging every variation I could detect. As the contact moved deeper into the formation, the relative amplitude of different components in the composite emission profile shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would have triggered any automated alert in the standard configuration, but measurably. The hull resonance component, drawn from one of the 11 source vessels, would increase in amplitude by a small percentage, while the component drawn from another would decrease by a corresponding percentage. The overall signature remained composite interference, but the composition of the interference was changing. I ran a correlation analysis between the amplitude shifts and the contact's position within the formation. The correlation was not random. When the contact was adjacent to a cluster of Vashari destroyers, the hull resonance components that increased in amplitude were the ones drawn from human vessels that our archive classified as destroyer equivalent. When the contact was adjacent to the heavy line vessels, the components that increased were drawn from human vessels, classified as heavy combat equivalents. The contact was, in some sense I was still working to articulate, presenting the face of its hull that would produce the most discrimination confusion for whatever ship class happened to be closest to it at that moment. It was adjusting in real time. I logged this. I sent the analysis to Marathon. She sent it up the channel. The response from contact analysis was a 7-second silence, and then a request to reconfirm the analysis methodology, which I did, and then another silence, and then nothing further. I do not know if that analysis reached anyone in the tactical response chain in time to be useful. I do not know if there was any response the fleet could have made to it that would have changed the outcome. I know that I observed it, and I logged it accurately, and I transmitted it through the correct channels, which is what I was there to do. The outcome was what the outcome was. The silence on the other end was longer than it should have been. At 0523, the contact emitted a signal. For the first time since its appearance at 0317, its emission profile changed. It had been running passive only, drive wake and hull return, nothing outbound, no transmission of any kind. At 0523 it transmitted, short, dense, tight-coded, 4 seconds, then silence. I had the signal on analysis within 8 seconds. Frequency analysis, encoding pattern comparison, syntactic structure match. The decode tree returned a result in 11 seconds. The signal was encoded in Vashari Standard Transmission Protocol, our own protocol, not an approximation. The correct protocol at the correct frequency allocations, with the correct header formatting, and the correct syntactic structures, the same encoding our own vessels used every time they exchanged operational traffic. The message content was one word: processing. I looked at it for several seconds. Then I sent the decode to Marathon, and she sent it up the channel, and for the next 12 minutes, there was a great deal of traffic on the command frequency. I logged it without fully absorbing it, because I was thinking about the word and what it meant that the word was ours. Not borrowed, not adapted, not reverse engineered into a close approximation. Ours, used in its correct operational context, with its correct operational meaning. Processing was the fleet's vocabulary. That word in that context belonged to our institutional language. The formal register in which we documented the work we did to civilizations. We used it to mean, this is being concluded, this is being archived, this will not require further attention. Something had sent it back to us. At 0535, Admiral Teshvaram ordered the fleet to engage. The propagation fleet had 4,400 vessels. Approximately 600 were dedicated combat units. Light destroyers, medium-weight interdiction platforms fitted with weapons arrays, a formation of signal suppression columns that served double duty as combat support ships in close engagement, and 12 heavy line vessels that were the fleet's primary fighting backbone. The remaining 800 were the operational apparatus, signal processing ships, the broadcasting platforms through which the fleet performed its processing work on, civilizations, fleet support logistics, and the medical and repair elements that sustained the fleet on multi-year deployments. The 600 combat units were ordered to form on UMV Sorath 0317 and engage. I watched the formation geometry develop on my passive array. 600 vessels beginning their approach, destroyers to the forward edge, heavy line vessels forming a center mass, interdiction platforms fanning outward in the standard dispersal pattern designed to deny the contact any viable exit vector while the forward engagement proceeded. It was clean and practiced. The fleet had executed this pattern against targets considerably more formidable than a single 4-kilometer vessel. The pattern assumed that the target would attempt to exit through the flanks, and was positioned to prevent that. The contact held its bearing, inward, toward the third planet, toward us, not accelerating, not maneuvering, moving at precisely the same pace it had held since 0317, as if 600 warships converging on its position were a navigational fact to account for, rather than a reason to alter course. The two formations converged. I want to be careful about the sequence of what followed, because it is easy in retrospect to impose a clarity on events that was not available in real time. What I am about to describe is reconstructed from my own logs and from the fragmentary records of other vessels that survived, which I reviewed later. In the moment, sitting at my station on the Sorath Null at safe distance with my passive array running at maximum resolution, what I experienced was confusion. The specific controlled confusion of watching events that refused to match the pattern they were supposed to match. At 0547, the contact entered signal merge range with the leading edge of our engagement formation. Signal merge is the condition in which two high-emission objects approach each other closely enough that their emission profiles begin to interfere with each other's discrimination. Under normal circumstances, this was a manageable complication. Filtering algorithms separated the two sources cleanly enough for tactical purposes. At 0549, the filtering algorithms failed to resolve the merge, not a malfunction. I checked the diagnostic immediately. All systems nominal. What was happening was that the contact's composite emission, that unresolvable signature, the 11 ghost hull return, was producing emission that the filtering algorithms were classifying, incorrectly, as multiple Vishari vessels in close proximity. This was not random error. The contact's hull was built from 11 processed human ships, and those 11 ships had been cataloged by the propagation fleet. Our archive used that hull composition data to calibrate our emission discrimination algorithms. The algorithms are tactical systems used to determine what was ours and what was not ours. And so the contact, by existing, was generating emissions that our own calibration data could not cleanly distinguish from our own formation, because the calibration data had been derived from the same hull sections the contact was built from. We had cataloged our way to our own blind spot. At 0553, the first friendly fire incident occurred. An interdiction platform on the outer flank, its fire control system receiving targeting data from a passive array that could not cleanly discriminate the contact from the surrounding formation, identified a Vishari destroyer on its own side as a hostile return and fired. The destroyer's automatic point defense responded. For approximately 40 seconds, two of our own ships exchanged fire while their commanders worked to override the automated systems and establish that they were not in contact with a hostile contact at all. This was the beginning. Over the next hour, I watched the engagement from my position at safe distance. The contact moved through the outer formation on the same bearing it had maintained since 0317. It did not accelerate or maneuver. It did not seek the best tactical angle or attempt to maximize damage rate. It fired with a regularity that I found, even then, deeply strange. Not the rapid cycling of a ship attempting to destroy as much as possible as quickly as possible, but a measured, unhurried discharge pattern that reminded me of nothing so much as the way a skilled technician moved through a complex procedure. Each step attended to in the correct order, not hurrying, not improvising. The targeting sequence, which I was only able to reconstruct fully afterward from the combined logs of multiple surviving vessels, proceeded as follows. First, the signal processing ships. These were not combat units, but they were the nodes through which command authority was relayed across the 400-vessel formation. They were positioned behind the combat line for protection. The contact engaged them from the forward edge of the engagement zone, moving through the formation, reaching through the combat line to the protected interior. Losing signal processing nodes degraded the fleet's ability to coordinate responses, to relay orders from the admiral to the outer elements, to maintain the information picture that tactical decision-making required. Coordination was the first thing to be addressed. Second, the broadcasting platforms. The large, slow vessels that carried the actual operational apparatus, the transmitters, the frequency synthesizers, the encoding systems through which the fleet performed its work on civilizations. These were the fleet's operational core, the reason the propagation fleet existed. Their destruction was not only a tactical loss, it was a statement about what the contact understood it was doing to us. Third, the interdiction platforms. The vessels positioned to close the contact's exit vectors and prevent it from leaving the engagement zone. The fleet had deployed them to keep the contact inside the ring. The contact was now using them as targets, systematically reducing the fleet's ability to execute the withdrawal it would eventually need to execute. Fourth, the heavy line vessels. The fleet's primary combat fighting ships engaged last, after coordination had been degraded, after the broadcasting apparatus had been destroyed, after the interdiction ring had been compromised, after the destroyers and combat platforms were dealing with ongoing friendly fire incidents in their own targeting systems. By the time the heavy line vessels were fully engaged with the contact, their support structure had been methodically removed. There is a word I have been turning over since 0706, since the emergency channel delivered both transmissions. And I want to examine it carefully, because I think it is the most important word in what happened to us. The word is method. The propagation fleet had a method. We had developed it over 30 years, refined it across 14 processing operations, and it worked with extraordinary reliability. The method was, identify the target civilization's communications architecture completely, reproduce it with sufficient fidelity to be indistinguishable from the original, introduce corrupted versions into the target's own relay network, and allow the corruption to propagate. The method worked because it used the target's own infrastructure against itself. The target civilization could not easily distinguish the corrupted transmissions from legitimate ones, because the corrupted transmissions looked, from the inside, exactly like the legitimate ones. The method exploited the assumption that familiar-looking things are safe. The ISV uncatalogued had applied the same method to us. It had identified our system architecture, our classification algorithms, our discrimination systems, our archive calibration data, completely enough to build something that looked, from the inside of our systems, exactly like a known set of finished threats. It had used our own archived data to replicate the appearance of things our systems considered non-threatening. It had introduced, into our engagement formation, a contact that our own fire control and discrimination systems could not cleanly separate from our own vessels. It had corrupted our ability to see ourselves. This was not a coincidence of design. This was the method, applied in the other direction. Someone had studied what we did, understood why it worked, and built something that did the same thing to us. I had spent 11 years as a tool of that method. I had sat at the outer edge of 14 systems and logged the signals of 14 civilizations that had no idea the familiar-looking transmissions beginning to appear in their relay networks were ours. I had kept the outer watch while the broadcasting platforms did their work, and the civilization's communication networks collapsed from the inside. I had done this carefully and correctly, and without giving the weight of it much thought, because it was my function, and I performed my function. The ISV uncatalogued sent us our own first contact preparation notice back through our own emergency channel and our own protocol, and told us that catalog was complete and the record was filed. I have been sitting with the specific shape of that act for several weeks now, and I am still finding new surfaces to it. I noted this sequence in the log as I began to understand it. I did not know what to call the pattern beyond what it demonstrably was. I used the language I had available. The contact was executing an operation. Each stage created the conditions for the following stage. The sequence was not the sequence of a vessel fighting for its life. It was the sequence of a vessel doing its work. At 0611, Admiral Teshvaram ordered withdrawal. There is one more thing I want to log before I describe the aftermath. At some point during the engagement, I cannot pinpoint the exact time because I was managing multiple analysis streams simultaneously, and my log entries in the 0600-0650 period are less precise than I would like. I noticed that the contact's rate of fire had not varied, not since the first discharge. Through 600 vessels converging on it, through the friendly fire confusion, degrading our formation coherence, through the withdrawal beginning, and the compression at the interdiction ring, gaps, through all of it. The contact fired at the same measured interval it had established at the start of the engagement. I thought about what that meant. It did not mean the contact was invulnerable, or operating at full effectiveness throughout, or that the fleet's combat units were having no effect. I do not know, and will not pretend to know, the condition of the ISV uncatalogued's hull at the end of the engagement. My passive array could not provide that level of detail from my position. What the consistent rate of fire told me was something about operational planning, rather than about hull condition. It told me that whoever had designed the contact's engagement doctrine had specified a rate of fire, and that doctrine was being adhered to, regardless of the tactical situation's development, because the rate of fire was part of a plan, and the plan was proceeding as intended. A ship that is fighting for its survival does not maintain a metronomic fire rate. A ship that is working a pre-planned operational sequence does. The propagation fleet's engagement doctrine was built around the assumption that whatever we engaged would be reacting to us, adjusting to what we were doing, making decisions based on the evolving tactical situation. Our doctrine was designed to outpace that reaction, to create a situation that deteriorated faster than the target could respond to. The contact did not appear to be reacting to us. It appeared to be executing its plan. Our response to the plan was a variable the plan had accounted for in advance. This is the thing that stays with me, not the loss of 4,353 vessels, not the specific numbers. The thing that stays with me is the quality of the attention that must have gone into building a plan that treated 600 Vashari warships as a known variable to be accounted for, not an uncertain threat to be responded to. The quality of attention across 11 contacts over 22 years that produced that level of understanding of what we were and what we would do. Someone had been paying extremely close attention to us for a very long time. We had not noticed. We were not designed to notice. The outer watch was designed to monitor threats in the outer dark coming toward us, not to consider the possibility that what was looking back at us from the outer dark was looking carefully enough to build something we could not see. The order was correct. The engagement was not proceeding according to any doctrine the fleet had, and a fighting withdrawal to consolidate and reassess was the right judgment. The problem was the interdiction ring. The interdiction ring had been established by the fleet's own interdiction platforms to prevent the contact from exiting the system. Establishing the ring required 12 anchor platforms at the ring's structural nodes, and once active, breaking the ring, opening gaps large enough for significant numbers of vessels to pass through, required coordinated action by the anchor platforms. By 0611, 6 of the 12 anchor platforms were not responding to command signals. The ring was compromised in multiple sectors, but the compromised sectors were not evenly distributed, and the gaps were not positioned or sized for a rapid mass withdrawal of 600 vessels under active engagement. What followed was a compression. Vessels attempting to withdraw concentrated at the functional gaps. Concentrated withdrawal in a combat zone, with active fire ongoing and discrimination errors, still producing targeting anomalies in automated defense systems, produced cascading secondary incidents. I will not attempt to describe all of them. I watched what my array could show me, and I logged what I could determine, and I kept my station and my bearing and my distance. At 0643, The fleet's command frequency traffic became fragmented, still active, still carrying orders and status reports and damage assessments, but fragmenting in the way a command structure fragments when its communication nodes have been reduced below the threshold that allows coherent coordination. Individual vessel commanders began making independent decisions. Some of those decisions were correct and some compounded the situation. From my position at safe distance, I could not always determine which was which, and I logged the uncertainty alongside the observable facts, because accurate logs require both. At ZO651, the contact passed through the inner boundary of what had been the engagement formation and continued inward on the same bearing it had held since 0317, toward the third planet, toward whatever came next. It had not changed that bearing once. Not when 600 warships began their approach. Not when the first engagements began. Not when the fleet ordered withdrawal. It had proceeded as if nothing that had occurred in the past hour and 4 minutes had altered its route, because, as far as I could determine, nothing had. At 0706, the Soreth Nal's emergency general receive channel activated with an incoming signal. This channel accepted transmissions from any source on any frequency, without filtering, designed for distress broadcasts, all call warnings, the kind of signal that needed to reach every possible receiver regardless of established communication protocols. Both Marathon and I heard it because emergency channel traffic was routed to the ship's audio system by default. The signal was encoded in Vashari Standard Transmission Protocol. It was 38 seconds long. In structure, it was a Vashari Propagation Fleet First Contact Preparation Notice. The formal communication we broadcast to a target civilization at the beginning of every processing operation, informing them that their communications architecture was being audited, that any attempt to transmit beyond the processing zone would be suppressed, that the process would proceed on the fleet's timeline, and that the record would be archived upon completion. I had heard that notice transmitted outward 14 times. I knew its structure, as well as I knew my own logging procedures. Every formal element in this transmission was correct. Every protocol parameter was correct. The frequency allocation was correct. The header formatting was correct. The operational vocabulary was correct. The syntax was correct. The addressee field had been changed. The notice was addressed to the Vashari Propagation Fleet. When it finished, after a 2-second pause, the second signal came, 11 seconds, also in Vashari Standard Transmission Protocol, direct, addressed to any Vashari vessel on emergency general receive. It said, "The catalog is complete. All material has been logged. All signatures have been archived. 11 source entries. 14 target operations. The method is understood. The method has been applied. This transmission is the archive entry for Propagation Fleet. First Vashari contact. Classification uncatalogued. Processing complete. The record is filed. This will be no further concern." I sat at my station for 4 minutes and 9 seconds after the signal ended. I counted the seconds. I noted the timestamp. Then I entered the transmission content in the contact log and appended a designation that did not exist in the standard vocabulary list. The designation I chose was processed. It did not feel like bravado. It felt like the accurate word. Marathon came to my station and read the entry and the designation. She stood beside me in silence for a while. Then she instructed me to encrypt the full transmission record, both the first contact preparation notice and the 11-second archive entry, message, and store it in 3 separate locations on the Soreth Nal's internal archive, with a notation against outbound broadcast, until we had physically returned to Vashari space and reported in person. She did not explain the instruction in detail, but the reason was evident. If we retransmitted the archive entry message outward, if we broadcast on our own frequencies, in our own protocol, the signal that said the propagation fleet had been processed and its record filed, we would be doing precisely what the ISV uncatalogued had done, with our own first contact notices. We would be using our architecture to propagate the record of our own conclusion to every receiver in the operational region. I stored the transmissions in 3 encrypted archives and applied the notation. At 0736, I ran a passive array sweep of the engagement area. I noted the results in the log with the same format I used for every other log entry, because format was the discipline that kept a log accurate. 47 active drive returns, out of 4,400 vessels. The engagement had lasted 4 hours and 19 minutes from first contact to the point at which the ISV, uncatalogued, passed through the inner boundary of the formation. The contact itself was not among the 47 returns. It had continued inward during the withdrawal and aftermath, and was already beyond the range at which my array could track it at useful resolution. It had departed the way it had arrived, on its bearing, at its pace, without ceremony, as if what it had just done was a thing completed and moved on from. Of the 47 returns, I estimated 31 were combat units in various states of damage, and 16 were support and logistics vessels that had cleared the engagement area early in the withdrawal phase. I noted class distribution and damage assessments for each, and logged them in sequence. On the fleet's general status frequency, in the hours following, I heard the 47 surviving vessels attempt to account for what had happened. I did not transmit, I received and logged. That was my function, and I performed it. I heard grief in those voices, the compressed, working grief of people, still in the mechanical business of surviving, who cannot give the weight of a thing full acknowledgement until the mechanics are handled. I heard commanders reconstructing the engagement sequence from fragmentary records and arriving, one by one, at the same understanding I had reached. The ISV uncatalogued had been built specifically to defeat the propagation fleet's classification discrimination systems, using data drawn from the fleet's own processed vessel archive. The method by which we identified contacts was the method it had been built to confuse. The method by which we cataloged completed threats had supplied the raw materials of the threat we had just encountered. I heard one commander say, "We gave them the blueprint. Every ship we processed, we cataloged it in full. We stored everything about those ships. And we thought that was the end of it. They read our storage and built the thing that lived in the space between all the entries we'd closed. In the gap the archive defined as finished," another said. "They understood our method well enough to send us our own first contact notice back in our own protocol. That's not analysis from a distance. That's years of study. Decades." I thought about the timeline as I listened. 22 years across 11 human vessel contacts. 30 years of propagation fleet operational signals, broadcast on our own frequencies, in our own protocol, receivable by anything in the operational region with equipment to receive them. 30 years of communications that said, in our own vocabulary, "Here is what we are, here is how we work, here is where we are going, here is how we classify contacts. Here is what our archive uses to calibrate its discrimination systems. Here is the full record of everything we have decided is concluded. A complete record, broadcast openly, readable, an archive not of finished threats but of a method." And whoever had read it had understood the method well enough to build something that the method could not see. We had built our operational empire on the principle that concluded things were safe things, that processed meant finished, that storing information about a threat was the same as neutralizing that information. Because we had decided it was inert, we had cataloged our way across 14 civilizations with the absolute confidence of a system that had never had its own cataloging turned against it. The ISV uncatalogued had named itself after the one category the archive could not contain it under, the negative space between 11 concluded files, the space that by definition our archive treated as empty. It had not been empty. At Zov 931, the navigation officer came to my station. He had calculated a return course to Vashari space and confirmed the ship's consumable status for the transit, and he asked whether I thought we should wait for other survivors to consolidate before departing. I told him that from a signal security standpoint, the material in the 3 encrypted archives I was carrying should reach Vashari space as quickly as possible, and that I favored immediate departure over waiting. I told him it was my analysis, not a command decision, and he should confirm with Marathon. He returned to his console. Marathon authorized the departure at 0944. Before we departed, she came to my station one last time. She looked at the passive array, which still showed the dispersing thermal fields of the engagement area, the returns cooling and diffusing, the debris expanding outward along its calculated trajectories. She asked whether I thought the ISV uncatalogued had done this before. I considered the question carefully, because it deserved careful consideration. The transmission had used 2 specific numbers in formal operational language, 11 source entries and 14 target operations. The first was the count of processed human vessels incorporated into the uncatalogued's hull. The second was the count of civilizations the propagation fleet had processed across its entire operational history. Both numbers were accurate. Both came from our own archive. The transmission had placed them in sequence, in the formal register of an archive record, in a way that treated both as confirmed quantities, facts checked and verified. 11 source entries. The uncatalogued knew exactly how many human ships we had processed, because those ships were in its hull. It had built itself from the evidence. 14 target operations. The uncatalogued knew the complete scope of the fleet's operational history, including operations that had concluded before the first human vessel contact 22 years ago. It knew our full record, not just our record of human contacts, everything. To know 14 target operations as a confirmed figure meant having access to operational records from the fleet's full 30-year history. That meant monitoring our signals across 30 years, or having access to our archive through some other means, or both. 22 years of human vessel contacts was not enough to produce knowledge of 14 target operations spanning 30 years. I told Marathon, the transmission numbers suggest access to the full operational record of the fleet's 30-year history, not just the 11 human contact files. Everything we have transmitted, everything we have archived, everything we have relayed on our own frequencies across the entire operational period. She was quiet. I said, we assumed our signals were transmissions. They were also a record. Whoever received them and read them did not see operational traffic. They saw a detailed account of what we were and how we worked, accumulating over 30 years, broadcast in our own protocol, available to anyone in range with the equipment to receive it, she said. We were broadcasting our own archive, I said. We were broadcasting our method, 30 years of it, in enough detail to reconstruct exactly how our classification systems worked and exactly what data they used to distinguish what was ours from what was not ours. She stood beside me for a while after that without saying anything further. Then she said, we thought we were the ones doing the processing. The Soreth Nal departed at 10:12. I was at my station, instruments at passive monitor settings, the log open, performing my function. This was what I had always done. In a situation where everything else had become unreliable, my function remained what it had always been. Receive what was present, record it accurately, note what was absent with the same precision as what was there. The system fell behind us. The heliopause fell behind us. The passive array returned to its baseline reading. Cosmic background at standard levels, stellar wind gradients, the faint and dispersing thermal echoes of what had been the propagation fleet growing fainter with each sweep interval, and then, eventually, falling below the resolution threshold of the array entirely. I logged the baseline at each sweep interval because that was the procedure. The silence of 4,400 absent vessels was the loudest thing I have ever logged. I thought about the ISV uncatalogued, somewhere behind us, on its bearing, at its pace, attending to whatever came next on its operational timeline. I thought about the word uncatalogued, the deliberate self-naming, the choice to identify as the thing the archive could not contain, the thing that existed in the negative space between 11 concluded entries. I thought about what it meant to name yourself after your own classification status. I thought about 30 years of Vashari operational signals, broadcast on our own frequencies, receivable by anyone in range. 30 years of communications that were, from a certain perspective, a detailed and openly available manual. Here's how we approach a system. Here's how we identify contacts. Here is how our discrimination algorithms are calibrated. Here is what we archive and how we archive it. Here is what processed means and why we use it. Here is the gap between what we archive and what we believe we can stop paying attention to. A complete manual, broadcast openly, free to read. We had processed 14 civilizations. We had never asked, across those 14 operations, whether the operational signals we broadcast at the beginning and throughout each through operation were teaching anything to anyone who received them. We had never asked because the question had not occurred to us. The question that does not occur to you is the most dangerous kind, because you cannot defend against it. The sweep runs at 6-second intervals. The passive array returns what is there. I log it. I think about the 14 civilizations in the completed operations archive, and I think about whether any of them had signal intercept positions at their system edges. And I think about what those positions might have logged in the months before their communications networks collapsed, and whether those logs survive somewhere in the dark, and whether they would, if I could read them, look very much like mine. I think about what else I might be reading our archive right now. In the negative space between our other concluded entries, in the gap between what we have stored as reference data and what we believe we have put beyond further concern, reading our transmissions. learning our method, understanding the specific shape of what our archive cannot see. I carry 3 encrypted archives and the knowledge of 47 surviving vessels, and I move through the dark toward home, and I do my work, because doing my work is the one thing that has not changed. The log is open, the record is accurate. The passive array sweeps at 6-second intervals and returns what is present, and I note it and move to the next entry. The cosmic background is at standard levels. The stellar wind gradient is consistent with our current position. The dark ahead is quiet. I heard one more transmission on the general status frequency that I want to log, because I have thought about it more than any other. A voice I did not recognize. An older voice, a commander's voice, someone who had been doing this work longer than I had, said the following. Approximately 20 minutes after the last of the tactical reconstruction discussions wound down into silence, he said, I keep thinking about the first contact notice, the one it sent to us. It used our exact vocabulary, our exact protocol, not an approximation, not a translation. It had been reading our operational signals long enough that our formal register was its formal register. When it filed us as processed, it filed us in our own language, using our own definitions, according to our own standards for what a complete archive entry looks like. And then he said, it understood what processed meant to us. A pause. It understood what it meant, and it chose that word specifically. Then the frequency was quiet again, and it stayed quiet, and no one contradicted him. And after a while the surviving vessels began exchanging navigational data for the return to Vasheri space. And the conversation about what had happened gave way to the practical business of what to do next. Because that is always how it goes. But I logged his transmission, because I thought he was right. The ISV uncatalogued knew what processed meant to us. It had watched us apply the word to 11 of its ships across 22 years. It had watched us move on each time, with the confidence of people who had finished a thing and filed it. It had watched us treat our own archive as proof that concluded things stayed. Concluded. And then it had concluded us and filed us, using the exact vocabulary we had taught it by example. I do not know what to do with that, professionally or otherwise. I keep the log accurate. I keep the instruments running. I do the work. The dark is quiet. I keep watching.